welcome to the Theology Mill, brought to you by Wipf and Stock Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle, and on this podcast we interview some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, philosophy, and more. Also, many of the folks we interview on the show are also authors with us at Wipf and Stock, where we have the honor of putting into print a broad swath of work that nourishes both the academy and the church. On this episode, I got to interview Dr. Emmanuel Falque for our Phenomenology Booth, which you can find on our website. This is a special extended edition episode simply because it's Emmanuel Falque. But if you've not heard of him, Dr. Falque is on the philosophy faculty at the Catholic University of Paris, and he's also the founder of the International Network in Philosophy of Religion. And finally, he's the author of many volumes on phenomenology, including his new book with us at Cascade, By Way of Obstacles, A Pathway Through a Work, which he describes as a kind of intellectual biography. So in this interview, Professor Falque and I discuss finitude, the body, the relationship of philosophy to theology, and we do all this via an engagement with the work of people like Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, and many, many more. If you're listening to this on Spotify, you should also know that you can read the interview at our Wipf and Stock blog, and you can find that link in the description below. So with that, let's head over to the interview. Let's start with our first question, which is, how would you describe or define phenomenology to someone who knows absolutely nothing about it or is unfamiliar with it?
Okay, hello, thanks for your invitation. So for your first question about phenomenology, so we know that phenomenology is difficult, or in fact it's not so difficult as we are speaking about it. But I could say that phenomenology is an attempt to describe the phenomenon. It is the manner by which Merleau-Ponty, for example, analyzes phenomenology in his preface of the Phenomenology of Perception. So what does it mean to describe the phenomenon? It means that what is first in phenomenology, it is a question of lived experience. Lived experience means what I experience in myself. That's why, and perhaps we will speak about it after, but the beginning of phenomenology is a question of reduction, époqué. And what does that mean, époqué or reduction? It means that we will put in brackets the existence of the thing to ask to myself my relationship to the thing itself. So, of course, phenomenology is a new research in philosophy, which is not first in philosophy of language as analytical philosophy, but in philosophy of experience. And in that way, phenomenology is very close from philosophy of religion, in fact. Why? Not because of the contents, but because of the way by which phenomenology try to work. It means that the phenomenology suggests to operate for myself a sort of conversion. It means that the question is not the question of time, but the link with the question of time. That was the question of time is only subjective. And even Merleau-Ponty will say that the space will be subjective and not only objective. So in that way, I think that the most important point is that phenomenology is first descriptive. It shows that we try to describe the phenomenon and not to make any judgment about it. That's why, in fact, the ethics of Levinas is not really an ethics. But there is no values first. It's not values. So description first, and then reduction. It means that it doesn't mean that the existence that I will doubt about the existence of things. And it is the difference between Descartes and Husserl. because in a certain way, Descartes destroyed the world with his doubt, because nothing exists except myself, thinking about me, the cogito, and so on. But for Husserl, who is the father of phenomenology, the things exist. But he just wants to say that the existence of things are not first. And for example, in a dream, something exists. And it exists for me. And perhaps I will be afraid, I've been afraid more in a dream than in what we call reality. But the very interesting point in phenomenology is the fact that we not live in only one world, which is what we call the reality. In fact, there is a sort of extension of reality, because my reality, the reality, is my reality. I'm living in it, about it. Okay, so the phenomenology is a question of the meaning of my existence, and that's why we speak about intentionality, meaning, and so on. Even if my work now try to show the limits of meaning in phenomenology too. That is a way by which I think we can describe, explain what is phenomenology. And one point which is absolutely new now, I think in my generation, it is to say that phenomenology is no more autosufficient. It means that we need something else. For me, for example, it is the question of religion and gospel, but it can be the question of psychoanalysis, it can be the question of literature, and so on. Voilà. So phenomenology is no more, I think now, only a sort of philosophical way which is closed on itself. And I think that it is something absolutely new in phenomenology now, and what I explain a lot in my book, By Way of Obstacle, the last book I publish now in English, a sort of intellectual biography.
Yeah, you're sort of getting into the terrain of the theological turn, right, in French phenomenology, and kind of the explosion of phenomenology into theology, which we'll get to more of that later. But first, before we get to that, let's talk about maybe also for those who are new, what are 2 or 3 books in particular that you would recommend that are a good starting point?
It's not a so easy question. I think what I call to my student at the Catholic University of Paris, I think that the preface of the Merleau-Ponty's book, Phenomenology of Perception, is a very good introduction, only 15 pages, so it's not long, but he explained what is phenomenology. And he explained that phenomenology is what Husserl called the return to the things themselves. And what does it mean, the things themselves? But the things are not, for example, the pencil, because there is a distinction in phenomenology between das Ding und die Sache in Dutch. Das Ding, it is the thing which exists in front of me. And die Sache, in French, la chose, it is the thing which concerns me. So the return to the things themselves, le retour aux choses mêmes in French, excuse me to speak French, the return to the things themselves, it is not the return to the things outside of me, which will be a sort of empiricism. It is a return to the things by which I am concerned. So it means that this pencil exists as a things outside of me, but it is my pencil, and I need it to write on my paper. In that way, this thing is a thing for me. So I think that first, this text of Merleau-Ponty is a very good one to understand what is phenomenology. Second point, if someone wants to have a very good introduction or a very good course on phenomenology, I think that the Jean-Luc Marion book, Reduction and Givenness, Réduction et Donation, is a very good one. Because in fact, at the beginning, it was a course he gave in Sorbonne on Husserl first, and then on Heidegger. And then he developed his own reduction. But I think it's good. But of course, it's more complicated. And then, of course, if you want to speak about the debate in phenomenology, I think that the French theoretical turn in phenomenology of Janicaud is a very interesting point. And plus, but it is one of my book, but the Crossing the Rubicon, because Crossing the Rubicon is not a polemical, but a book in debate about phenomenology today, what we have to do in phenomenology today. So perhaps the three texts, the preface of Merleau-Ponty, of course, the book of Marion, more technical, of course, the book of Janicaud, because the French theoretical turn, and perhaps Crossing the Rubicon to about what we can do today, especially in philosophy of religion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about, I mean, maybe we're going to get into kind of more complicated works here, but what about your own favorite phenomenologist to read? Who would that be and why? And then also, if you had to pick, this is probably a really hard question, but if you had to pick one or maybe even two or three of your most treasured volumes of phenomenology, which ones would you choose and why?
So it's a hard question too. So I can give you a sort of confession. I will say it first. The book of Jean-Luc Marion, The Idol and Distance, his first book, in fact. This first book is a book which is a sort of completion of many papers he wrote in Communio. In fact, why I speak about that book? Because I remember, so I was young, like you, about 30 old. I have, at this moment, I have two daughters. And I remember that one of my friends, woman I knew in a community, a Christian community, she told me there is a professor in Poitiers. Poitiers, it was not Paris. Huh? He's specialist of Descartes. Nobody knows Marion at this moment. Nobody. I never hear anything about Marion and so on. And he wrote a book, L'idole et la distance. Said, okay, good. And me, at that moment, I was studying theology in Paris, in Centre-Sèvres. Because one of the difference between me and Jean-Luc Marion, Jean-Louis Chrétien, Michel Henry, and so on, is the fact that I studied theology in an institution. I have a diploma in theology, which is not the case of the other, except, of course, Jean-Yves Lacoste, because he's a priest, so he studied theology too. So I was studying theology, but I was in Paris, in Centre-Sèvres. It was as all the Germanic theology. It was completely Germanico, Dutch theology. So we discussed only with Hegel, with Karl Barth, Bultmann, Moltmann, Jungel, and so on. But philology didn't exist. So when I studied philosophy first, I studied philology when I was a student. And then when I came in theology, I was studying theology, which was renewed by Hegel. And that's it. And then I remember, that's why I speak about it. Perhaps you know this sort of situation. My daughter was about 2. I remember that the moquette, the ground was blue. And I took the book at 6 in the morning, and I read the beginning of The Idol and Distance about ontology, theology. And it is the first time that I feel in myself that there was a possible unity in my life and in my thought. Because between what I did in philosophy and what I'm doing now in theology. So that book has been very important for me, the first chapter, the chapter on Nietzsche, and so on. And it is by that way that I met Jean-Luc Marion. So I've never been a student of Marion, in fact. I met Marion because of his books, and because that is a second confession, but why not? Because I animate a sort of session for Christian people I was in a Christian community. That was philosopher, but I never did that. So I spoke them. It was a sort of spiritual retreat, but I spoke about idol, distance, icon, and we prayed in front of an icon. So I sent a message to Jean-Luc Marion. I found his address to said, it's a sort of spiritual, your work is so spiritual. And I saw that Marion was like Dennis, completely in a retreat, far from the world, always pray, and so on. And then Marion phoned to me and said, "Oh, who are you? I don't know you. Come now to meet me." And that is in that way. So that is my meeting with Marion, which is very interesting. Of course, now I disagree with Marion on many points. It's very well known. It's not to be against Marion, but it is because I have my own way. But we are very friendly and very friendly with his family and so on. And it is a very surprising fact in France. And many people who come from US or even from England ask me, how is it possible to disagree with someone and to be so friendly with him? It is like that in France. In France, you have no dialogue without combat, but this combat is a sort of friendly. It's friendly. That's why I wrote a book, which is, you know it, I think, The Loving Struggle. Why is the loving struggle? Because in that sort of struggle, you find your own way. So that is one of my most important book in phenomenology. It was the book at the beginning. And by the way of the work of Marion, I found in myself a sort of unity between phenomenology and theology. So now I change, of course, and I'm developing my own way, of course. I'm a bit old now. I'm no more 30. And I like a lot Jean-Louis Chrétien, who died a few years ago, 2 years ago. It's very important for me because he's spiritual. And the second one, who is very important for me now, is Henri Maldinet. So Henri Maldinet is not very well known in US, not a lot translated. But in fact, he worked on phenomenology and psychiatry and phenomenology and aesthetic. And his way on psychiatry is very important for me. And my last book, not yet translated, Hors Phénomène, the extra phenomenon, about the traumatic experience. I wrote that book during the pandemic. I explained that there are five trauma, which are illness, separation, the death of a child, natural catastrophe, and pandemic. And so Maldinet is very important for me and for many French philosophers today. So that is also for me a very important point. I will say Marion, of course, at a distance, Jean-Louis Chrétien and Henri Maldinet are very important for me now. And of course, last point, Merleau-Ponty. Why Merleau-Ponty? Because in fact, you have 3 generations of phenomenologists. I explained that in an interview with Tarek Dika, but I think it's very important. The third generation, Lévinas, Merleau-Ponty, was a generation of Husserlian. There was Husserlian people. Michel Henry is also an Husserlian, absolutely not an Heideggerian. After, you have the generation of the Heideggerian. Why the Heideggerian? Because Heidegger has been introduced in France, you know, perhaps, by Jean Beaufray. Jean Beaufray was the professor of Jean-Luc Marion, when there was a class préparatoire in Paris, of Jean-Louis Chrétien, and of Jean-Yves Lacoste. So during May 68, they said, well, you don't have to study psychoanalysis, sociology. So Marion and all of them were completely against May 68, and they came back in the tradition, and the distinction between the ontic and the ontologic said, bah, psychology, sociology, they are ontical science, but we develop ontological phenomenology about the design, the return to the things themselves. So, but me, I am in another generation, which is more a Merleau-Pontian one, And one of the characteristics of Merleau-Ponty is the fact that he discussed with all the science. That's why, for example, I wrote a small book about philosophy and psychoanalysis. Ça n'a rien à voir. There is nothing to see. So that's why I'm not in the same way of Marion, but because I'm absolutely not in the same generation. The generation of Marion was a combat against May 68. Me, I was 5 in May 68. So I never knew that. So me, I developed my thought during the 80s. And this moment in France, it is a moment of the abolition of the pain of death and so on, of discussion. So it was another time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have to confess I didn't know about your book on the phenomenology of the somatic, but I was certainly very, very excited to read an English translation whenever that comes. So that's very exciting for me to hear. You've touched on kind of the difficulty of phenomenology already when you were introducing some of the books that might be good for beginners. And obviously, I think, right, phenomenology is kind of well known for being pretty heavy on the jargon, pretty difficult to get into. So as far as kind of key terms, what would you say are some of the most important ones for folks to know? And then how would you define some of those key terms?
Yes. Well, first, I want to say first that phenomenology is not a sort of what you called a jargon or jargon, but sometimes it is like that. Why? Because at the beginning, Husserl was first a mathematician. And the mathematician, he creates some concept, he needs some word. So, in fact, Husserl is always very complicated. And it's so complicated that many of his disciples said, you are too complicated. We want to come back to a sort of realist phenomenology. And if you are reading, for example, Edith Stein, it is easier than Husserl and even Heidegger. Because if Heidegger also create many neologisms and try to find some etymology, we are sometimes false, of course. But Heidegger is easier to read. And if you read Merleau-Ponty, it is very easy to read Merleau-Ponty. That's why some people said in France that Merleau-Ponty was not a phenomenologist or a philosopher, but only a sort of poet. Me, I remember that one of my friends, Renaud Barbaras, he wanted to do a PhD on Merleau-Ponty. He's in the same generation of me, and he found nobody to follow him in his PhD because Merleau-Ponty was not a philosopher. He was a sort of poet because he invented some term, it is not rigorous, and so on. So that is the first point. So for me, we do not have to stay only in a sort of technical phenomenology. And one of the difficult points, and it is a shame in France, is the fact that now many people are specialists in phenomenology. They develop a sort of jargon. It's a jargon, so nobody understands what they are speaking about. And now nobody speaks no more about Heidegger because the carnet noir, the black carnet, the black papers, and so on. So now everyone is studying Husserl, so Husserl is complicated, so phenomenology became complicated. So first, phenomenology is not complicated. And the most complicated point is to not be complicated. It's very easy to be complicated, in fact. So, and what does it mean to not be too complicated? It means that we have to describe the phenomenon. And that is difficult. And for example, in my book, The Extra Phenomenal, Hors Phénomène, I try to describe what does it mean when something falls on me. Illness, for example, the death of a child. And the idea is the fact that when something falls on me, I'm completely blocked. It means that there is no more horizon, nothing can appear to me, and I can't have anymore any access to me. So it means that in that way, you have no more saturated phenomenon, you have no more subject, you are just here, astonished to be always here. What I call the crisis. So that is the first point. Now, what are the the most important key terms to be introduced in phenomenology. Of course, first it is a reduction. What I spoke a bit about it before. No phenomenology without reduction. I'm sure it's very important. It means that the fact that to put in brackets the thing which is in front of me allow me to ask myself about my relation with the thing. Now that is the first point. The word does not exist independently of me. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but it means that the meaning of my existence is the fact that I in link with the word. So now there are many contestations in France about that point, because the realism is coming back and so on after finitude and so on. But I absolutely disagree with that. I think that if we do that, if we speak about the things which exist independently of me, we lost what was the heart of phenomenology, which is the meaning of existence, the existential relation with the things. So that is the first point. Then you have, of course, the concept of intentionality. What does it mean, intentionality? Intentionality means that my consciousness, as said Merleau-Ponty, is not like a box in which you put the things. So you put the thing in your box and so on. No, my consciousness is an act. And the act means that I am in relation with the things by the affect, for example, by the thought, by love, and so on. It means that it's impossible to say that first I see you today by visual conference, and then I think, oh, he's very sympathetic. No, when I see you, I am instantly thinking if you are sympathetic or not, if you are nice or not, and so on. It means that you don't have first representation and then affectivity. But there is always an affectivity in the representation. So that is what Husserl calls intentionality, and why it is so important. It is important because you have many intentionalities. You have many ways to be in link with the thing. So you can see this pencil on the mode of perception, but then you see it on the mode of imagination or on the mode of souvenir. And what Husserl will say, he will say the two modes of apparition, perception and imagination, are two modes of apparition of the thing, but it doesn't mean that the imagination or the representation is only a copy of the thing. There is no copy. It means that after this interview, when you will think about it, the interview will continue to exist, and it will continue to exist on the mode of souvenir. So we have the interview first before it began. It was the interview on the mode of anticipation. You sent me an email. Is it possible to have an interview? So it exists. Now we have the interview on the mode of perception, and then we will have the interview on the mode of souvenir. But what is the meaning of the interview? It is not only now. It is not only on the mode of perception. It means that the interview on the mode of anticipation can be more important than the interview on the mode of perception, because if it doesn't work, you stay on the interview on the mode of anticipation. So you see that it's very interesting. Why? Because by the way of intentionality, you have many ways, many acts to be in relation with the things, and phenomenology is a study of the acts of consciousness, or the act of body. So that is now the first term, which is K term, which is very important for me. In phenomenology, it's not only reduction or epoche, intentionality, but the question of body. Because what is new with Merleau-Ponty? In fact, it began with Husserl, but only in his manuscript, or a bit in the crisis. It means that there is not only an intentionality of consciousness, but there is an intentionality of the body. Now, what does it mean, the intentionality of the body? It means that I am in relationship with the things by my body. But the difference of my body between consciousness is the fact that I have absolutely no consciousness of what's happened with my body. But when I come in a room, in fact, I open the room with my body as I open a representation with my consciousness. So it means that the orientation of my body is doing the space. So you don't have first the space as l'étendue chez Descartes, and then I am going in the space. Here you are not in my office. I am not in my office at home. I am at home, but I open my office. And now I open my office to you by my body, by seeing you, and I open my office to the people who see me in my office. So I'm not in my office, but I open my office by my body. And then in this question of body, you have, of course, a distinction between chair et corps en français, flesh and body. And in fact, flesh, the term flesh, in fact, is complicated because it is Körper and Leib, it is Leib in German, Dutch. So German, Leib, it is my manner to leave my body. And Husserl, and then Merleau-Ponty, and Ricoeur, then distinguish between flesh and body. Body is the body itself, as a thing, Körper, and the flesh is my manner to leave my body. Of course, we always develop a phenomenology of flesh. Why a phenomenology of flesh? Because the aim of phenomenology is to develop the relationship within the things. So the relationship of my body with the world, I can call that flesh because it's my lived body. But me, my work is to coming back to the body itself as a thing, the Körper, because we forget the biologic Körper. We will speak about theological reason, but also theological reason. Because I wrote a paper in God Without, in the Love and Struggle about Michel Henry, a very well-known chapter, is there flesh without body? Because I think that Merleau-Ponty, there is flesh, my manner to leave my body, there is flesh in Christ, but no body. Or Tertullian, father of church, explained that Christ has a true body with bones like me, with hair like me, which is not a manner to leave my body. So I think that distinction is very important, and I create a concept which is the spirit body which is between the extended body of Descartes and the lived body of Husserl. And what does it mean, the spirit body? I wrote a book on palliative care about that, about the ethics of the spirit body. It is a paper, but it is a book in French. It is a paper translated in English too. And what does it mean? It means that the spirit body, it is my body, my biological body as animality. But you are not only like an animal because I see you as a human. So it means that we have a true body, an animal body, a biological body, but it becomes human because of the manner to see it. Exactly as a centurion, I don't know how you say that in English, we said that when he was at the feet of the cross of Christ, this one was truly the Son of God. He's like an animality, but he was the Son of God. So he's a two. He's a true flesh on the cross. But he see him as the Son of God. So I think that the three most important key terms to know theology for me are reduction, intentionality, and body, and this distinction between flesh and body. Just an introduction, but to explain, to try to help the people to be introduced in theology, exactly what I'm doing by way of obstacle by myself, to explain how to be introduced in theology too.
Yeah, so you in your book, Crossing the Rubicon, you're kind of exploring, we've touched on this a bit already, but you're kind of exploring the relationship between philosophy and theology. And you had mentioned earlier how you were one of the only ones among your colleagues in phenomenology who's actually formally studied both, or who at least who has degrees in both. But tell me a little bit more about some of the recent developments in this theological turn in French phenomenology, and then maybe a little bit of where your own thinking fits within those movements. right? As far as your own work, right, in Crossing the Rubicon, again, you talk about, and I'm quoting here, the immense fecundity of phenomenology for theology, but you also talk about the counterblow, in your words, of theology on phenomenology that has sort of yet to be carried out. So, and then elsewhere, you're kind of talking about this as a return shock is another term in English that you use of theology onto phenomenology. So I guess my question, or my second question, is what do you have in mind by such a counterblow or return shock?
So, thanks. So this book, Crossing the Rubicon, has been very important for me. It is one of my friends who asked me, we were on the street in Paris, and said to me, now you wrote many books, The Guide of Gethsemane, The Metamorphosis of Finitude, but what are you doing exactly? So I try to, Crossing the Rubicon, that's why I think it is also a good introduction to my work, but not so easier than My Way of Obstacle, which would bore here and speak about it is a sort of biography, intellectual biography. But so Crossing the Rubicon, it is a sort of discourse of the method on my work, if I'm speaking like Descartes. So I will give you a third confession, another confession. What's happened when the French theological turn of Janicaud has been published? I was in theology too. I was finishing my theology in Saint-Osève in Paris. I saw that book, no, it's not here, I can show you, but a very small book, Edition de l'Éclat, and then nobody was speaking about that book. I've been to the library. I explained there is a very interesting book on French phonology. Perhaps you can order it. I said, okay, a small book and so on. And then it was just in 1991. I was nearly 13. So there was a conference organized in the University of Nanterre near Paris about that. I've been there. There was about 150 places. We were no more than 30. So nothing happened. And during this conference, there was missionary was present, Janicaud was present, Jean-Luc Marion was present, Notre Ricoeur, and Jean-Luc Chrétien was present. In fact, at the beginning, it was nothing. And then when Janicaud wrote his book, many of philologists said, it's a pamphlet, he's against, because he's a true Heideggerian, it is a sort of orthodoxy, and so on. And me, at the beginning, I thought the same, and I thought in myself, it's not correct to make a sort of correction of Marion as a copy, correction of Henri, correction of Ricoeur, because in fact, when you read the text, he always said, it's not what Husserl said, it's not what Heidegger said, and so on. But, in fact, it's very interesting. Why? It's very interesting because it is first a sort of diagnostic of what is happening in France. And then the second point is the fact that it is a sort of suggestion, a sort of proposition, what we have to do today. So the diagnostic is right. A sort of theological turn happened in phenomenology since the publication of Totality and Infinity of Emmanuel Levinas in 1961. It's true. In fact, it happened by Levinas, and Levinas, as you know, was absolutely not a professor, not in university. So he was only the director of the Israelite Center in Paris. So it was possible for him to do what he wants. But the interesting point is the fact that Marion, Chrétien, Henri did that. Who are Marion, Chrétien, and Henri? They are professors in the university. And you know that in France, because of laicity, you don't have to speak about theology at university. It's impossible. It's forbidden. That's why if you want to study theology in France, there is no theology in the state universities. No theology. except in a small center. But you can study theology only in the Catholic universities. So there is a proverb in France, chasser le naturel, il revient au galop. Hint the natural, it comes back au galop as the horses. It means that it describes the French people. Because it is forbidden, you do it. You forbid me to study theology, so I will do it for myself. Exactly what did Marion. Exactly what did Jean-Luc Chrétien. Exactly what did Michel Henry. So me, I did the same, but the difference between Marion and me, one difference, what I explained at the end of Crossing the Rubicon, and a lot in by way of obstacle, said I always refuse to advance masked. It is Descartes who is speaking in his first book, Young book. You have to advance avancer marqué on the theater of the word. And Marion told me the first time I met him in his office, you have to do like me, advance mark. I said, never. I was nearly 13, never. So perhaps because I am the Catholic University of Paris, it is easier to not advance marks. But so what is true is the fact that in the Janicaud's diagnostic, it is true that the question of God came back in phenomenology in France, in the place where we don't have to speak about God in university. That's why the debate about phenomenology and religion, religious studies, never happened in France at the beginning. But after, and the point I want to suggest is that in 1991, during this conference, Michel Henry were present. Michel Henry told to Janicaud, dear colleague, I absolutely do not understand why I am in this book. I never wrote anything about theology, even a small chapter on Meister Eckhart in the essence of manifestation. And it was true. But 10 years after, or 9 years after, Michel Henry published I Am Truth, then Incarnation, and so on. So the very interesting point is the fact that Janicaud saw before Michel Henry what Michel Henry will do. That's why, in fact, Michel Henry is in the French theological term, but it is checked only 10 years after, but not at the moment when he wrote that text. So I think that it is... so this book is a very important one. It is a very important one for me now, on a point which is the beginning of my new book, Hors Phénomène, the Extra Phenomenon. It is the moment when Janicaud asked, but what did you do about the dramatic phenomenon? Because in fact, nothing is dramatic in phenomenology when you see it. It is a face in Lévinas, it is a givenness in Marion, it is a prayer in Chrétien, it is a liturgy in Lacoste. But what about the drama? What about illness? What about the separation? What about the death of a child? What about a natural catastrophe? What about a pandemic? That's why me, in a certain manner, many people told me, but you are no more a phenomenologist. The question is not to be or not to be a phenomenologist. The question is to describe the phenomenon. Of course, I came back to Spinoza. Of course, I came back to Deleuze. Of course, I came back to Michel Henry, to Foucault, and so on, to try to find a new way. But it doesn't mean that I'm no more phenomenologist, because a phenomenologist is someone who tries to describe the phenomenon. But I am on the limits of phenomenology. So that is the point. And in fact, it's possible just to add a point. Many people told to me or speaking about me, writing that I am only a theologian. Falque is a theologian. He's not a phenomenologist. In my way, it's completely false. First, now it's completely false because my last book, which is more of 400 pages, is only on phenomenology. It is like it is a book like Étant donné of Marion, so only on phenomenology first. So and the Loving Struggle is only on phenomenology too first, and then I explain in in Crossing the Rubicon that more we theologize, more we philosophize. It means that it is when you do some theology that you know when you do some philosophy. And one of the difficulties of the older generation is the fact that they are doing some theology when they say that they are doing some phenomenology. So me, I absolutely do not separe the two fields, but I try to create a sort of a chock between the two. That's why your second question, which is what does it mean, the return chock or the counterblow of theology on phenomenology? It means that it's not enough, in my eyes, to phenomenologize the theology. It means that sometimes it seems to me that the phenomenologists give lessons to the theologians. Oh, you could do that. So, for example, the beginning of incarnation of Henri, or the beginning of I am the truth. It is, you don't have to work anymore about the history of theology, the history of the text. You have to go direct to the text. So you have no discussion with the theologian. It is a bit the same in my head with Marion, who explained at the beginning of God Without Being that it should be good if the theologian could describe the phenomenon and so on. So, but I always said I'm not practice theology. So me, I'm completely against this sort of method, which is a manner to be what Merleau-Ponty called attitude de surplomb, to be up and to see the theologians and to give them lessons, to explain to them what they have to do. When you study theology, you understand, and Marion knows that now because his last book about Revelation is more theological than the others. We have a lot to learn from theology. So because I studied theology, and first patristic and medieval philosophy, because it is my first formation. My PhD was on Bonaventure, which is published in English too. In theology, for example, you can't speak about flesh only like a live body, because I just speak a bit about it before, but for Tertullien is absolutely against Docetism. And what is Docetism? It is a manner to say that Christ only adopted a sort of flesh, but he didn't assume a true flesh, with blood, with chair, with hair, and so on. And Tertullien, in his book, The Flesh of Christ, is completely against that, because he explained that Christ was not an angel. It is against the thesis of the angelic Christ, and he gets a true flesh. So it is an example when we have to develop the counterblow of theology on phenomenology. It means that if there is a true flesh in theology, and I think it is the same in the Wedding Feast of the Lamb, because in fact there is a sort of turn in my work between the Metamorphosis of Finitude and the Wedding Feast of the Lamb. Because when I finished the Wedding Feast, the Metamorphosis of Finitude on resurrection, birth and resurrection, someone wrote to me later, never published, but I could publish it, and this one was a medicine, a doctor, a neurologist one, and he told me, Mr. Falque, perhaps you fall in what you criticize. Why? Because you explain that resurrection is a resurrection of the live body, like a bit like Merleau-Ponty, like missionary. But what are you doing about the true body, biological body? And he told me, but Mr. Falque, there is the cadaver of Christ is no more in the tomb. So if it was only the live body was resurrect, the biological body has to rest in the tomb. So I'm just finishing just now, 1 week ago, a new book. A new book will be published next year, and the title of this book is La chair de Christ, the flesh of Christ. And it is a book on that point. What do we have to do today about the biological body in the Eucharist, in the resurrection, and so on? So we'll see what happens, but well. So I think that it is an example of the return shock of phenomenology, of theology on phenomenology. You could say the same about finitude, and so on. So that is the way what I explained in the Crossing the Rubicon, and what I try to do, for example, in the Wedding Feast of the Lamb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of in like terms, turning to kind of the more explicitly theological, right? In your interview with Terek Dika in his book, in their book, Quiet Powers of the Possible, you talk about the influence of the Second Vatican Council, as well as John Paul II's idea of the new evangelization. You talk about these as kind of important for the development of phenomenological thought. So how would you describe the importance of these two movements in particular on the thinking of phenomenologists who are Christian like yourself?
Thanks. So new evangelization has been very important for me, as for many people, but not in the way in which we are speaking about it, because I change a bit in my work, but the new evangelization for me, the meaning of what the Pope John Paul II tried to do and to expose is the fact that we have to come back to the question of experience of God. And that's why he wrote a PhD in phenomenology, as you know, and on Max Scheler, he wrote on Max Scheler, his PhD, and this question of experience was very important for me. And I think that the two important authors for Jean-Paul II are Thomas Aquinas and Max Scheler or Edith Stein. So it's very well known. But new evangelization is often interpreted like a sort of apologetics. But for me, there is no apologetics. And it is absolutely a profound gap between Jean-Luc Marion and me, because we are not coming from the same field. Perhaps when I was young, I was thinking about apologetics as if everyone has to become Christian as me and so on. But that changed a lot on that point when I was about 35. And I wrote a chapter very well known and discussed in the Metamorphosis of Finitude. Is there a drama of atheism? Which is a reference of the de Lubac's book. And I explained, no, there is no drama of atheism. So what does that mean? There is no drama of atheism. So even in US, it's very complicated. But in fact, it means that the times change. You have many friends around you, brothers, cousins, and so on, who do not believe in God. I think it's the same in US and in France. Not so much, perhaps, but you can't condemn them. And it's not enough to think you have to become like me. You have to believe in Jesus Christ, and you do not change. Because if you do not change, and if you want only change the other, you are not in a sort of dialogic situation. So, in my way, the new evangelization is not apologetics. I want to say it is prophetics. What does it mean, prophetics? It means that it is a sort of avertissement, a sort of, it is a question, be careful of what happened. And I think that what the new Pope Francis is developing now is more close of what I am doing. It means to discuss, to be in relationship with what is different of me. And for example, in my book on psychoanalysis, I explain that there is not only a backlash of theology on phenomenology, but also of psychoanalysis on phenomenology and so on. And so what is important for me in Vatican II, and the reference to Vatican II, in fact, it is not the question of new evangelization, which is coming from Jean-Paul II, but it is a question of the opening of Vatican II. And I always quote the opening of Vatican II by the Pope John XXIII, which is, we need today to develop the doctrine with the concept and the means of our epoch, of our today, of our culture. And what does it mean? It means that if our culture is defined today by finitude, exactly what Foucault said. He said that finitude is the figure of the modern human. In that way, we have to come back to the modern culture and to translate the message in the modern culture, not to adapt the message, absolutely not, but to transform it. We have to do today, but not as him, but look, what Thomas Aquinas did for Aristotle. What did he do? He took the novelty which was Aristotle, but it did not translate Aristotle in theology. He transformed Aristotle in theology. For example, about the contingency, because the two causes, the first cause and the second cause, a sort of transformation of consciousness. So we have to transform the culture by Christianity, of course, but it is a transformation, which means that first we have something in common, what I call l'homme tout court, the human as short. We are human as short before to be a believer. That's why we have something in common. And I think that it is a point completely forgotten by the generation of phenomenologists up to me, Marion, Chrétien, Henri, and so on. Because there is a sort of apologetics. It means exactly what said Marion. You see what I see. If you don't see it, I hope you will see it today. So what I refuse. So that is a very important difference. And that's why there are many, many people who don't believe in God. We are not Christian. We are reading my books. Because there is a sort of cultural ground of the books. Resurrection means something even in culture. It means that it is not only Harry Potter, resurrection. Even if you see a sort of Christ who goes through the walls, who appears and the disciples don't recognize him and so on, he's disguised as a gardener. Many things that are very complicated to understand and to believe.
Yeah, so you're talking already about some of your differences with Marion, you've also talked about how friendly you are with him and his family. So what are kind of the areas of his thought that find the most resonance in your work? And then on the other side of things, kind of what are the parts of his work that are maybe most in discord with your own?
So I can say Marion is and was my master, and we need to have master. And I try now to be masters for students. And you are not only friends, because you need to have master. You need to have people who are for you some examples to follow. And Marion has been someone like that, and he's always someone like that. Why? First, because he worked and he continued to work and continued to write books. And me, when I am with students and even with American students and with American colleagues, I explain that it's not enough to ask to the students to speak. They have to speak and we will say what we are thinking about what they say. No, we have to write lecture, we have to, you see, the first Marion continued to work and work a lot and to try to that is a lesson for me. And not only, that is the first point. The second point I learned from Marion is to coming back to the text and to coming back to the tradition. And that is a very, very important point for all my generation. In fact, all the people were in PhD with Marion in the 19th. But we all did the same thing. It means that Marion taught that. It was true. First, I don't mind about what you are writing, about which author, and so on. Why? Because all the authors are good if we keep it in mind in the physical culture, what is true. Second point, you have to show that this one is not ontological. So, in fact, Marion read all the history philosophy through the Heideggerian interpretation, but not in a diachronic way, but in a synchronic way, and try to show what he did, that some authors, in fact, are not ontological. So he tried to show it for Blaise Pascal, a bit for Descartes, and then he asked to his students. So he did, Falque, you do it for Bonaventure. So I did it, but I changed. Then Bardou, you do it for Leibniz. He did it for Leibniz. Olivier Boulois, you do it for Duns Scotus. He did it for Duns Scotus. Vincent Caro, you do it for Pascal. He did it for Pascal, and so on. So, in fact, now this question for me of ontology is completely overcome. Dépasse. It's finished. In fact, ontology does not exist. We know that it was only an interpretation found by the young Martin Heidegger when he did his first master, small PhD, on Thomas d'Erfurt, and he thought that Thomas d'Erfurt was Duns Scotus, but it was a pseudo-Duns Scotus. But that's it. And what does that mean? Ontology means that there is horizontality, ontos, the being, which is in link with theos, God, in a logos, ontos, theos, logos. Ontology means that we always develop the question of immanence to refer it to a transcendence in a logos. No, that doesn't exist. But the point, which was very interesting in ontology, which Marion never saw, in my mind, is the fact that when Heidegger criticized ontology, it was to say that philosophy is not theological. It means that I want to study ontology without any theology. And in that point, if I want to study theology without any phenomenology, it means that finitude is first, horizontality is first. And in that point, wait a moment, there is something, okay. Okay, and in that point, the horizontality is first, the human being is first. Oh, what did Marion, and this is interesting, that he said it is not ontological, but why it is not ontological? Because the figure of God is not a principle. And this is true. And it is a distinction between idol and icon. But in fact, and if you ask me a difference between Marion, not only on the form, because I explained to you, for example, I do not advance max and so on, but on the contents, it is, for example, for me now, the link between my work and Nietzsche. Why? And his work with Nietzsche. Because in his chapter on Nietzsche in The Idol of Distance, with this book that has been so important for me at the beginning, he explained that the formula of Nietzsche, God is died, Dieu est mort, you have three interpretations of that. God is died. The first one is to say, as the theology of the death of Christ, or death of God, God is died, thanks Nietzsche, because you speak about Christianity, because Christianity is the only religion where God died, what we call the theology of death of God. But it was during the 70s. Then you have Jean-Luc Marion said, God is died. Yes, but who is died? The principle, the God of Plato, the God of the philosophers, and that's why we go back to Pascal and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not God of the philosophers. But in fact, what said exactly Friedrich Nietzsche in the Gay Science and the paragraph 125? Not only God is died, Dieu est mort, but God is died, Dieu est mort in French, and God rest died, and Dieu reste mort. He is always died. You have two sentences. So for me, the important point is the sentence: God remains died, rest died. So the question is the absence of God. So the question is not to say that we don't have to speak about the idol of God, and now we have an icon, and we have only to develop a sort of phenomenology of Christ. But God is dying because the power of resurrection died. That's why, for me, if we do not speak about resurrection, it will be the death of Christianity. Because resurrection is the force of God. So that is a point which is completely different between Marion and me, and that's why I discuss with Nietzsche, not to condemn Nietzsche, but to learn to Nietzsche. What does it mean, the question of force? What does it mean, the question of power? And we forget the question of force and the question of power. And for me, the Holy Spirit has not to be defined only as what God is giving to the world as in the Orthodox tradition, which is linearly, not only the love between the Father and the Son, which is in the Catholic tradition, but God, the Holy Spirit, is a force, exactly like in the Pentecost. So we have to come back to a definition of God as a force. So in that way, there is something very different between Marion and me, even in the question of apologetics, because for me, I have to be converted by someone who don't believe in God. So why? Because it's not sure that someone who don't believe in God lack of God. It's not sure. Because it is the theologian Herbert Jungel who explained that, who said that God gave the means to human being to exist without him. But without it does not mean against him. He gave the means to human being to be only a human being. And it is exactly what Merleau-Ponty said to de Lubac at the beginning of his conference in the International College of Philosophy. It is in my book, The Metamorphosis of Finitude, in that chapter about atheism. He said, but why you always say that the non-theology, la non-theology, is against theology? He said, it's not because I don't speak about God that I am against God. So the time changed because during the 70s, after May 68, it was a forthcoming between Christianity and Sartre and so on. The question was to be against God. So Marion developed a sort of apologetics to save God in front of the people who are against God, who criticize God, and so on, existentialism and so on. Me, during the 80s, absolutely not in the same situation. Why? Because the people are not against God. They don't speak no more about God. So the question today is not to be against, but the question today is to know, is there always a place to speak about God? Because if we don't speak about God, if God is not a word of our culture anymore, is it possible for God to encounter us? It's impossible. If God encountered Saul, Saint Paul, it was because Saint Paul martyrized the Christian people. And God said to Saint Paul, why do you persecute me? But if he said that, it is because he persecutes the Christian people. It is exactly the same way when Saint Augustine has been converted in the Garden of Nero. He said, what does it mean? Is it the God I heard about it by my mother Monique? And it is because Monique spoke about God that he recognized God. Mm-hmm. That's why catechism is so important. Catechism is important not to know the travel of Saint Paul in the Midiras. I don't mind, but it's important because we have to develop also a theology of culture. I know this term is very complicated in US, but a theology about the means of the dogma in culture to understand that God needs that we continue to develop that point in theology. In that way, I learned a lot from Marion, of course, in the way of his method to work, in the way of his relationship with tradition, of course. But I'm different of Marion in my manner to think, which is to not be advanced mask. And I'm different of Marion in the time when I developed my philosophy, which is completely different because, for example, I give an example in my relationship with Nietzsche. It doesn't mean for me that we have to save God. And I never said that everyone has to believe in God, but I just said that God needs our words to speak to us. For example, I don't have to convert the people because it is a work of God. But I have to give to God the means to do it.
Which is sort of liberating in a sense. You're also very well known for finitude, which we've touched on quite a bit already, right? Which is kind of a very Heideggerian term, right? This Heideggerian sense of like being toward death, right? And so in your book, The Guide to Gethsemane, for example, you're exploring this idea in detail, and especially the relationship between Christ facing his own finitude and then the human person facing his or her own finitude. So tell me maybe a little bit more about your conception of finitude as something that's inherent in human experience, and then how you also relate Christ's sense of finitude with the human person's sense of finitude.
So first, why I wrote that book, The Guide of Gethsemane. In fact, it was in the years I was doing my PhD. I was teaching at school, at lycée for the young people. I never thought that I will write a book in my life. In fact, in 1997, two of my friends died. One suicided, and the other one died in a car crash. So I've been very shocked by that. I was teaching philosophy for pupils at school. I was not at the university. I never thought that I will go in the university and so on. No? I was living in Tours. It was 60 kilometers from my house. I took a car to go to give course to small people and so on. That's good. And then I gave a lecture about the anguish of death in a monastery. And the priester, the brother were there, told me, it's very interesting. You could send your paper to a review. So I sent it to Nouvelle Revue Théologique. And that they respond to me, it's too big. You are writing a book. Writing a book, me? Is it possible to write a book, to publish a book? So I sent it. I did 2 parts of that. Only 2 on 3. I sent it to the editor, very well known in France, the Cerf. And then they respond to me, it's good, you finish your book, we will publish it. It was not finished. I finished it and I published it. And it has been published before my PhD. Oh, that is an important point. And the second important point, another confession, it was the fact that I teach about Sartre. To the pupils, the existentialism is an humanism. And I was on a bridge, I was coming back from my course, and Sartre said, you are the addition of your acts. You know that. Huh? Mm-hmm. So you can say, I should be a very good mother, but I never had children. I should be a very good, and so on. I should be a very good philosopher, but I never found time to write books. Mm-hmm. Miss it. I told me never. So that's why I decide to work immediately, and not to say, as often I see that in the American system, I need to have time to do my PhD. I need to have time to have a scholarship. In France, you have no scholarships. It's clear. Mm-hmm. You have no recommendation. It's clear. Mm-hmm. So everybody is working and teaching at the same time. Mm-hmm. But you have never the fact that I need to have time, and if I don't have time, I will do nothing. No. And it's not a condemnation to come back to the school to teach to the pupils. Mm-hmm. So the system is completely different, because we know that in France, we don't have money. We have perhaps some ideas, but absolutely not money. So it's different. So we are doing many things at the same moment. For example, I did my PhD in 3 years, 4 years. And at this moment, I have 150 pupils and more than 100 copies to correct each month. So you see, the system is different. Well, mm-hmm. That's good. But it is important to say that. So, and the second point is the fact that when those two friends died, I was reading Heidegger. And Heidegger spoke to me more than gospel, in fact. Mm-hmm. And Heidegger said, very well known, about the paysan de Bohème, the paysan of Bohème, when a man born is old enough to die. Mm-hmm. It means that the death is a consequence of incarnation. And not only of death, not only of sin, of incarnation. But so on that point, it seems to me that it is very important. And I think it's perhaps the same for Christ. When he born, he is old enough to die. If death is not only the consequence of sin, what does that mean? Death in Genesis, death is not the biological death. Death is a manner to be closed on the death. If you eat of the trees of the knowledge of the good and evil, you will die. But in fact, in Jewish, you will die to die. You will close on yourself. And that is a spiritual meaning of sin, which is very important. And it's exactly what said Tertullien and Irenaeus, for example. The first father of church said that. It changed a bit after with Augustine, but at the beginning of Christianity, it has that point. So, in that way, I was very close from Heidegger on the question of finitude. But Heidegger wrote in a note of Being and Time, I quote it in my memory, a question, it is on the paragraph about anxiety of death. A Christian can't live the anxiety of death because he always sees the death in the interpretation of life or in the view of life. It means that Heidegger said, for the Christian, death is never death because it is never end. It is a passage. A passage like when you have work on a road with your car, you have a deviation. So deviation, okay, you die, deviation, and then you will go in wisdom and so on. But at this moment, I thought, and I experienced it myself, because I didn't say that, but I'm very close from Ignace de Loyola, because I did the spiritual exercise during 1 month, 30 days, and very close from St. Francis. I did my PhD in St. Francis, but I converted when I was 70 in Assisi. So you see, Ignace de Loyola and St. Francis are the two piliers, the two, how we say, the two words when I wrote, okay? And at this moment, I read the gospel and I experienced for myself, and I wrote that the death of Christ was a true death. And in fact, when Christ say, it's finished, in English it is it's finished, but in French it all is accomplished. It's not the same. So it's finished. You find it in Aeschylus, in the tragedy of Aeschylus. I am on my one's end. Je suis au bout du road. It's finished. So it means that for the Christ, it's finished. As it's in English. Nothing happened anymore. So when on the cross, Christ does not say, I will die and I will come back in 3 days, because if it was true for me, I will do it immediately. But I die and my life is finished. So the Christ burned on him the finitude. And the second point I want to develop about your question about finitude, after the first point, which is why I spoke about finitude, what are the existential empirical reasons. The second point is the fact that we confused often in theology to finitude and finite, and it's not the same, because the finite is the contrary of infinite. It means that when you speak about the finite, it is a part of the infinite. So it means that you are an infinite, and then you fall in finite. Exactly what Descartes said. I have primary in myself the idea of infinite more than of the finite. And as I explained in Metamorphosis at the beginning of Metamorphosis of Finitude, all the French philosophies, in fact, are Cartesian. Because finite is first. Infinite is first. Totality and infinity, the faith in Levinas, givenness in Marion, prayer in Chrétien, incarnation in auto-affection in Henri, liturgy in Lacoste, it is always infinite, absolute. Then we can come back to Janicaud, because the question of Janicaud was, what did you do with finitude? And finitude is not the contrary of the infinite. Finitude has no contrary, because it is the origin of my life. In that way, we have to come back to what Foucault said about modern human being, and he said the figure of the modern human being is the figure of finitude at the end of Les mots et les choses, the word and the things, and analytic of finitude. And I think it's absolutely right. So if we want to develop the doctrine with the concept of, with the mean of the days today, of the culture today, it is a question of finitude. That's why for me, finitude and incarnation are the two terms the most important in my philosophy and in my theology too.
Yeah, and then from the Guide to Gethsemane, right? You're talking about metamorphosis already. You move into the Metamorphosis of Finitude is your next book, right? In which you're talking about this transformation of finitude into in the resurrection, right? And here you kind of have this really interesting interplay between birth and rebirth on the one hand, and then resurrection on the other. So you're using birth and rebirth as a kind of a way to understand resurrection. So what is the relationship in your mind between birth and rebirth on the one hand and then resurrection on the other?
So first point, the concept of transformation or the concept of metamorphosis became more and more important in my work. In fact, the difference between metamorphosis and finitude and the Guide of Gethsemane, and I changed at this moment, even in my relationship with Marion, Lacoste, and so on, is the fact that it's not enough to say that Christianity is a sort of paradigm up of the other paradigms. It means that you have aesthetic, you have ethics, and then you have Christology. No, because the resurrection changed everything, which is the title of the chapter of the Metamorphosis of Finitude. Why I spoke so much about metamorphosis or transformation? First, for theological reason. Why? Because the term of resurrection is also the term of metamorphosis in the New Testament, and particularly in St. Paul, in the first epistle to the Corinthians, in Corinthians chapter 15, and he said, everyone will we will not all die, but everyone will be changed, metamorphosis, at the final resurrection. So we will all be metamorphosed. That is the term of resurrection. That is first point. And so it means that the difference between me and the other phenomenologists of the other generation is the fact that we need a transformation of our humanity by divinity. And transformation need that, doesn't mean that we are better than the others, but we are transformed. So we can say that the experience of conversion is translated in phenomenology, in theology, by the term of metamorphosis or conversion. The second point, very important, that always on the point of view of theological point of view, is the fact that metamorphosis, in the case of resurrection, is not only our small conversion during our life, because many people are speaking about resurrection as conversion. So I lived a resurrection today because I spoke with my daughter. Okay, but it's not a resurrection. You can say, because resurrection in Christianity, it is a resurrection of the body at the end of time. That is more difficult to say that than to think that I'm converted. Resurrection is not only metanoia, it's not only conversion. So that is very important. That's why I speak about resurrection of body and try to think what does it mean to be a body in the case of resurrection. It is the case in my book I just finished about the flesh of Christ. The second reason why I spoke so much about resurrection, it is a philosophical, about transformation, is a philosophical one. So, in my book, Hors Phénomène, the Extra Phenomenon, not yet published in English, I give a sort of leitmotif, which is not the Heideggerian leitmotif, so much apparency, so much being. It is not the Marion's leitmotif, so much reduction, so much givenness, autant donné sur donation. But my leitmotif is so much exception, so much transformation. So much exception, something which happens to me will broke me. The death of my child, the separation with my wife, and all that case are outside of any question of sin. That is the important point. If you are separate with your wife, it's not the question. It's not your fault. It's not our fault. It follows you as an illness. And you said, "How is it possible that I am here now? And how are you? You are completely transformed. You are absolutely not the same anymore." Exactly what Spinoza said about the poetry with Gongora. And he said in the Ethics that the poet Gongora, we think that he has an Alzheimer. And he said he was absolutely not the same. He changed in his substance. It is exactly what happened. For example, if you lose a child, you change, you completely change. You can't recognize yourself. You are not recognized by the others. You are in a complete transformation. So, what is new? It is the fact that the concept of metamorphosis, which was first in my work a theological one, became a pure philosophical one. And we could say today that I develop a phenomenology of transformation, or a phenomenology of metamorphosis. And not only a phenomenology of exemplification. Something has to change. And this transformation is absolutely not an Hegelian one, as a dialectic one, because there is no overcoming, there is no Aufhebung, because I'm blocked. And when I'm blocked, I just constate that I'm here. And I am here, and that is the definition of crisis in my book. What is a crisis? And we are living many crises today after the pandemic, the coronavirus, now it is a climatic crisis and so on. We have to develop a philosophy of crisis, what I do, but in a ontological and fungical way. So what is a fungi of crisis? It is astonished to be always there and to not know why I am always present. But I am burned by myself. I have to bear the weight of myself. And the end of the book is speaking about the question of solitude. And I explain that there is a sort of original solitude. And in the case of the trauma, I am completely alone. If you love your child, you are completely alone. You can't share what you are living, even with your wife. You are alone. In your trauma, you are alone. So we don't have to share anything anymore, or the thing anymore. We have to recognize that there are some things we can't share, and those things we can't share are what we are, exactly what we are. And in that way, what I call the core of solitude. What is the core of solitude? It is a sort of wall in myself. I can go only around this wall to describe it, and I know that I have this wall. It doesn't mean that I am always alone, because I defined at the end of the book, love. What is love? Love is the link between two solitudes. You are in link with your wife if you are married, in the impossibility to communicate with her. It's paradoxical. Our incommunicability, what is incommunicable between us, is the reason why we love us. You understand that? It means that there is something in me I lived when I was young, and so on, and I am that. You know that I am that, but you don't know what it is. I know that I am that, but I don't know what it is. But we love ourselves in this impossibility to say what it is. You see that? So, in that way, this question of solitude, which is not solipsism, it seems to me very important on that way. So, we are always in transformation. In philosophy, it is in the extra phenomenon, and in theology too. That's why this question of birth and rebirth is a manner to speak about transformation. Why birth and rebirth? Because I have a conviction, and this conviction I had it at the beginning of my work, more than 30 years before. It was to say that in theology, it is impossible to speak about the dogma without link all the dogma, all the theological concept, all the theologumena to human experience. That's why if you don't do that, it is completely empty. If I say to you, you will resurrect at the end of time, you said yes. What does it mean, resurrect? It is a mystery. But it means nothing. Because if you read Thomas Aquinas, if you read everyone is speaking about resurrection, you can't say it is a mystery. If you say that, it is the end of Christianity. You have to think what is resurrection, this mystery, in the words of today. And in that way, you have to find a sort of example, or I don't say example, an existential to explain what you want to say in the dogma. So that's why we have suffering or death in human being, and then suffering and death for the Christ, the Christ of Gethsemane. We have the birth in human being and the rebirth for Christ. Why? Because when Nicodemus asked this question at the beginning of the Gospel of John, how a man can come back in the womb of his mother, and here Thomas Aquinas said it's a bad question because he didn't understood that he was speaking about the spirit birth and not the charnel birth, the flesh birth. In fact, the response of Christ is, what is birth from the flesh is flesh, what is born from the flesh is flesh, what is born from the spirit is spirit. But it's not an opposition. It is an analogy. At the same manner that flesh is coming from flesh, at the same manner the body is, the spirit is coming from spirit. So you have to develop a phenomenology of flesh to develop a theology of resurrection. So you see, and then you have the same from this is my body in the wedding feast of the Lamb. Because in this is my body of the wedding feast of the Lamb, this is my body, it is the sentence that it is possible to say it in a couple, the sexual relationship, this is my body. So you have to develop what does it mean a sexual relation, this is my body, to understand how this sentence for Christ is erotical too. And the term of passion is not only the suffering, because passion in French, it is a desire, a passion. You can say that it is in French, in English too, the passion of sky, the passion of skateboard. I did skateboard when I was young. The passion is a hobby. And what said the Christ at the beginning of the passion? He said, I desire of a big desire to eat this Passover with you. A desire of a big desire. The desire of the desire, it is the definition of the human desire in Hegel. So you see, Eros and Eucharist. I did the same for the Holy Saturday, just now, just a few months ago, and it will be in my next book on the flesh of the body. What is the Holy Saturday? We never speak about the Holy Saturday. It is the moment when Christ is coming where? In our suffering, in our trauma. He's coming in our trauma. The Holy Saturday is not about sin. The question of sin is the end of time. So Christ is coming in what I live, but it was not because of my fault. The death of my child, my illness, and so on. So in that way, you say that we have to develop a phenomenology of trauma to develop a theology of the Holy Saturday, what I called God extra phenomenon. And what God can do that we can't do, that in the case of God, and exceptly in the case of God, what I explained in the chapter, it is possible for God only to be with me in my solitude. Because he's resurrected. Emmanuel, that is my name, my first name, Emmanuel, God with us. So it means that if I am always in solitude with the other, in what I am suffering, the death of my child, God can be present with me because he's resurrected. It is no more me who is lived, but it is a Christ who lives in me, as said St. Paul in the Epistle of Galatians. You see? So that is the question of the rebirth, very important.
Yeah, moving to our last couple of questions, you've kind of already danced your way into this talk of the flesh, the body. You also use terms like animality and human animality, especially in your book, The Wedding Feast of the Lamb, which you mentioned. So my question is, what exactly do you mean by these terms? You've touched on this a bit already. And then how do you relate them to the Eucharist specifically?
Alors, this question of animality has been very important for me. It is also spiritual, in fact. At the end of my book, I explained to you that at the end of my book, The Guide of Gethsemane, it was complicated to believe in resurrection anymore because it was only finitude. And then I thought about the question of transformation and I lived this transformation. But at the end of my book, Metamorphosis of Finitude, it seems to me that my concept of flesh was too abstract. And at this moment, I was least for myself a difficult experience, but in fact, it was not so difficult. It was difficult for me. It was only the fact, I explained you the fourth confession today. It was the fact that I bought a house and I haven't sold the other one. So I have two houses, you understand that? I have a family with 4 children. So it was absolutely incredible. And I remember that we have been in front of the sea with all my family. And my wife told me, stop to see only on the ground. And I said, shit. And I come back in my car. I took my notebook and I note Nietzsche was right. It was the end of Heidegger. Nietzsche was right. Why? Because we have to come back to the passion, to the pulsion, and so on. And at this moment, I have a spiritual accompaniment, spiritual director. And she was a woman, a sister, and she told me, if you want to write a book about the Eucharist, you don't have necessarily to go to the Mass each day. What I have to do. Mm-hmm. You have to live and you will see. Well, she was Ignatian. And me, at this moment, I realized that if God is not present in my passion, in my drive, and so on, mm-hmm. He's not there anymore. So, at this moment, this concept of animality has been very important for me. Why? Because the concept of animality is for me first a methodological one. When I speak about animality, I don't speak about animals, even if I like animals and so on. I live in the campaign. No, I speak about animality. And what is animality? Animality is the contrary of angelism. What is an angel or angelism? It is a consciousness without body. Exactly the Cartesian cogito. I think so I am, but I am without body. But what is animality? It is the contrary. It is a body without consciousness. You see? The contrary of the angel. And the question is, what does it mean to be a body without consciousness and not a consciousness without a body? And as Nietzsche showed it, and before Nietzsche, Spinoza, we can do more with our body than with our consciousness. The Spinoza example is the example of the somnambulism. You can do many things with your body in the case of somnambulism, but if you wake up, you fall. It is exactly the same in the BD, on the film of the BD. You work and then you are in front of the BD, and then you see you fall. It is exactly the same of Peter during the tempest in front of the Christ. He's on the sea with his body. But when he sees that he's on the sea, he falls, he cools. You see? So we can do more. As said Spinoza, we don't know what the body can. Nous ne savons pas ce que peut le corps. And the body can more than the consciousness. So we have to develop a philosophy of the body. So I don't speak anymore about the phenomenology of flesh, a philosophy of the body to explain what does it mean, this is my body. And in the erotic experience, it is biological too. It is not only what I feel. No, there is resistance of the body, there are difference of the bodies, and so on and so on. So in that way, animality belongs to humanity. It's obvious today, if you are thinking about Darwin and so on. It's not obvious for all the Christian people, but it has been recognized by Rome only 20 years ago. Okay, but so there is animality. But why we don't speak about animality in theology? Because we don't develop the distinction between animality and bestiality. In fact, what is bestiality? Bestiality in philosophy is the act to refuse our animality. In French, but I think it is the same in English, you said sale bête, bad beast. So it's bestial. You don't want. And you're against bestial people and so on. So what is bestiality? Bestiality is sin. And what is bestiality? It is a possibility for animality to fall down under the animality. It means that bestiality, paradoxally, is a possibility for human being only. Only human people, only human beings only a human can be bestial. That's because only a human can, for example, have some pornographic comportment, and so on and so on. Not the animal. So it means that the animal is always an animal. But a human being can fall in the bestiality or be metamorphosed in humanity. So now, if I come back to the reading Feast of the Lamb, which is for me a very important text, book, what does it mean, the Eucharist? The Eucharist, this is my body, what Christ said to the church and to his disciples. It doesn't mean only you took my body and now it's a sort of divinization. No. What is the Eucharist? It is a sort of humanization of animality in filiation. So what does it mean? You are animal because there is in you drive, passion, and pulsion. And they are good. They are good. But you can follow in bestiality with this drive, passion, and so on. But you can also be transformed in humanity. So what is the Eucharist? The Eucharist is a way by which your animality is transformed in humanity, not for you become only a human being, because the aim of Christianity is absolutely not humanism, but for you become the Son of God as a human being. It means, and that's why I'm now very close from Thomas Aquinas, because, and it is the difference between what I call the limited phenomenon in front of the saturated phenomenon of Jean-Luc Marion. It means that we have been created in the limit, and the limit is good. It's good to be limited, and we don't have, as said Descartes, to say I am unlimited in my will, and I am limited in my thought, or my entendement, in my no. In fact, I have been created in a limit. But as I explained that finitude is not the infinite and the finite, the finite and the infinite, it is the same. The limit is not limitation. What is limitation? It is the fact to regret to not be limited. But the limit is what I am. I am created in the limit, but the difference between Thomas Aquinas and Heidegger, and that is a very, very important point, and it is in my book. I just want to say that because it's not well known, but in my book translated in English, but only in the English translation of my book on Bonaventure, The Bonaventure and the Entrance of God into Theology, there is an afterword, Thomas Aquinas and the Entrance of God into Philosophy. And I developed this concept of limited phenomenon from Thomas Aquinas, and the difference between Heidegger, not Marion, but Heidegger and Thomas Aquinas, it is the fact that the finitude for Heidegger is only a constat. It is like that. It is a fact. The fact of finitude or facticity. But for Thomas Aquinas, finitude or the limit is the desire of God. God creates us as human beings. It means that completely different of him. In that way, animality is what we are. We can fall in bestiality or become human being in filiation, but we never have to overcome, to break our limits, because we have been created in our limits. Exactly what said Thomas Aquinas is very astonished, because when he speaks about beatitude at the end of time, he said that God will highlight responsibility in our limits. So, but we will always stay in our limit because we are created and we are a creature. And in that way, to finish, this distinction between animality and bestiality is not only a philosophical one, it is an existential one, and we know ourselves, each of us, what does it mean to fall in bestiality, because of course we fall often in bestiality, more than we have transformed in humanity by our animality.
Yeah, that's beautiful. All right, let's move to our final question, which is about your forthcoming book with Cascade, which we're really excited we'll be publishing in the next few months, which we mentioned already. It's titled By Way of Obstacles, A Pathway Through a Work. So what is, for our readers and our listeners, what is your purpose in writing this book? And then kind of more to the point, how do you go about providing a pathway through your work?
So that book, By Way of Obstacle, and you know it, you read it, is in my mind a very important one. Why? Because I think it is a more personal one. I speak about me nearly exactly when I'm speaking with you now. It means that for me, it is a sort of intellectual biography. So at the beginning, it was a debate during a conference, and I record the debates and so on. So, of course, there are many objections, and I try to respond to many objections. Because do not forget that I am a Franciscan and Ignatian one. I am a Franciscan because the love of the word, because the presence of God in creation and so on, the joy and so on. And I am an Ignatian. Why? Because of the question of discernment. And discernment is first. Discernment is not only an intellectual position, it is a spiritual position, it is an intellectual one. What does it mean? It means that I can find my way through the others, to discuss with the others. As in the spiritual exercise in Ignace de Loyola, you discuss with God. You said yes, no, okay, for that way, no, this path is not the good one, and so on. And that's why my book, The Loving Struggle, is so important for me, because it is the moment where I discussed with the others, with Marion, with Merleau-Ponty, with Derrida, with Henri, with Chrétien, with Lacoste, and so on, to find my own way. So in that book, By Way of Obstacle, which is, I think, a very good title, the translation of Parcours d'embûche, I am like an horse to say, okay. But I rewrite the book. In fact, this book is not the translation of the French one. Because I rewrite the book and I put out all the discussion with the French people and so on to make of this book a sort of intellectual autobiography. So I think that this book, we will see, is a very important one because it is perhaps a better introduction on my work by myself. It's very easy to read. You can read it in a train. It's not complicated because sometimes people said to me that my books are complicated and we would like to have a book more less complicated. So Heidegger is complicated, Michel is complicated, Marion is complicated. So it means nothing. Huh? But that book has been written. First, has been written for myself, and I think so. It is a very good introduction to my work. And the second point I want to highlight is the fact that in that book you have all my work. It means that I try to link that chapter of that book to that chapter, and to try a sort of coherence of all my work. And then last point, the third one, is the fact that in that book I give many confidence for people who can read it, and the fact that it is a sort of spiritual way where I develop my own way, and many passages about, for example, what does it mean to write? Mourriez-vous de ne pas écrire? Will you die to not write? And so on. So it is my life, which is written in this book, and that's why I suggest to the people to read it to introduce to my work.
Yeah, we're extremely excited to have it published, and honestly just very honored to be publishing it, and it'll
Mm.
be coming out in the next few months.
It
But I
will be
think
a lot of work for you.
maybe not for me necessarily, maybe on the marketing after
For
the fact.
someone. Okay.
Yeah, for someone in-house, definitely. But I think this is
But
a great place to wrap up our interview. I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure and an honor to speak with
okay.
you. I know it's evening for you, so have a wonderful evening. It's only 9 a.m. here on the Pacific Coast of the U.S., so I'm just finishing my tea and getting my day started. But
Okay.
thank you again for taking the time. I
Okay.
really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm hoping to see you again. Okay.
Yeah, most
Allez.
definitely. Yeah. All right.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Ciao. Ciao.
Thanks for listening to the Theology Mill, brought to you by Wipf and Stock Publishers. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, you can subscribe to our show because we have a lot more coming your way. So with that, I'm your host, Zach Mickle, signing off on this episode of the Theology Mill. We hope to see you again to share a drink and talk all things theology. But until then, good friends, God bless, and we'll see you soon.